The year was 1851, and the cotton fields of Arkansas stretched like white wounds across the earth. The morning air carried the acrid scent of burning tobacco and unwashed bodies. In the Whitmore plantation house, where the floorboards creaked with secrets and the walls held screams like pressed flowers, lived a woman named Ruth. Her fingers, calloused from years of service, trembled not from weakness, but from a rage so deep it had calcified into her very bones. Before we continue, drop a comment telling your location and time. Ruth had learned to move through that house like smoke, silent, invisible, essential. The Whitmore family saw her as they saw the furniture, useful, necessary, but never truly present. They did not see the way her eyes memorized every corner, every lock, every escape route. They did not notice how she counted their breathing at night, cataloging their vulnerabilities like a hunter studying prey. Her sister Lily had been different. Where Ruth burned quiet and steady like banked coals, Lily blazed bright and defiant. Lily sang while she worked, her voice carrying spirituals that made the other slaves pause in their labors, hope flickering in their chests like candlelight. Master Whitmore tolerated it because his guests found it charming, the melodic backdrop to their evening conversations about cotton prices and the weather. The morning everything changed. Ruth was in the kitchen before dawn, as always. Her bare feet knew every loose board, every cold spot on the stone floor. The lard was rendering in the great iron pot, filling the air with its thick, acrid sweetness. Steam rose from the cooking surface like prayers ascending, and Ruth stirred with mechanical precision. Her mind elsewhere, she could hear them in the next room. Master Whitmore and his eldest son, Thomas, their voices low and urgent. Words drifted through the thin walls like smoke. Property, discipline, example. Ruth's spoon never paused in its circular motion, but her breathing grew shallow. She had heard these conversations before. They always preceded suffering. The kitchen held the memory of every meal she had prepared, every tear she had shed over boiling water, every prayer whispered into rising bread. The copper pots reflected her face in fractured pieces. An eye here, a mouth there, as if even the cookware understood she was breaking apart. Through the window, she could see the slave quarters, small wooden boxes lined up like graves. Smoke curled from a few chimneys where early risers were already stoking their fires. Lily would be among them, probably already humming some half-remembered song their mother had sung before the fever took her. Ruth's chest tightened with a love so fierce it felt like drowning. The sun climbed higher, painting the kitchen in golden stripes. Ruth moved through her morning routine, grinding coffee, slicing bacon, kneading biscuits, but her palms worked without conscious thought. Her mind was trapped in the memory of yesterday evening, when she had seen Thomas watching Lily with eyes that made Ruth's skin crawl. The way he looked at her sister was the same way he looked at the horses before breaking them. The coffee was bitter as burnt dreams when Master Whitmore finally entered the kitchen. His presence filled the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Ruth kept her eyes down, focused on the biscuits browning in the Dutch oven. The metal radiated heat that made her face flush, or perhaps it was the rage that lived just beneath her skin, always simmering, always ready to boil over. Ruth, Master Whitmore's voice carried the lazy authority of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. Send word to the quarters. I want all hands gathered in the yard after breakfast. Ruth nodded, her throat too tight to speak. All hands gatherings meant punishment. Someone had transgressed, and the rest would be forced to watch as Master Whitmore made his example. The biscuits suddenly smelled like ash in her nostrils, and Ruth? Master Whitmore paused at the doorway, not bothering to turn around. Tell them to bring the strong rope from the barn. The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. Her knees almost buckled, but her grip continued its work, pulling biscuits from the oven with practiced efficiency. The rope. She knew what the rope meant. Everyone knew what the rope meant. After Master Whitmore left, Ruth stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by her tools. The knives hung in neat rows, their blades catching the morning light like silver teeth. The heavy pans sat ready for the next meal, their surfaces black with years of use and seasoning. The fire in the hearth crackled with apparent cheerfulness, but to Ruth's ears it sounded like laughter, cruel and mocking. She moved to the window and looked out toward the quarters again. Lily was there now, hanging wash on the line, her movements graceful despite the heavy burden of wet fabric. Even from this distance, Ruth could hear her sister humming. The sound drifted across the yard like a bird's song, pure and unaware of the trap closing around it. Ruth pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she could see her sister as a child, gap-toothed and giggling, chasing fireflies in the brief moments of freedom after the day's work was done. She could smell the sweet grass they used to braid into crowns, could taste the wild berries they had stolen from the master's garden, could feel Lily's small hand in hers as they whispered stories to keep the dark at bay. The memory dissolved as footsteps approached the kitchen. Thomas Whitmore entered without ceremony, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Ruth didn't turn around, but she could feel his presence behind her like a storm cloud. His breathing was slightly labored, as if he had been running, and there was something else in the air now, the sharp scent of anticipation, of violence held barely in check. "My father says you're to ring the bell," Thomas said, his voice carrying an odd excitement. "But first I wanted to tell you something." Ruth's reflection in the window glass looked like a ghost, translucent, insubstantial, already halfway to disappearing. She watched Thomas approach in the warped reflection, his image distorted by the imperfections in the glass. "Your sister," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting. "She's been spreading ideas, dangerous ideas, about running, about freedom. Can't have that kind of thinking spreading through the quarters like wildfire. Sometimes you have to prune diseased branches to save the tree," Thomas added, a phrase he'd clearly heard his father use. For the first time, Ruth detected something almost like uncertainty in his voice, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The metal pot on the stove began to bubble more vigorously, the lard spitting and hissing like an angry cat. Ruth's fingers, still holding a wooden spoon, began to shake. She could see Thomas in the reflection, standing close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair, the whiskey on his breath. "Sometimes," Thomas said, reaching out to trace a finger down the window glass near Ruth's face, "sometimes you have to cut out the infection to save the body. You understand that, don't you, Ruth?" The morning sun climbed higher, and the kitchen grew oppressively warm. Sweat beaded on Ruth's forehead, ran down her spine, pooled at the small of her back. But inside, in the place where her heart should have been, everything was turning to ice. Days blended into a singular moment of dread as Ruth walked toward the bell tower that stood like a sentinel in the plantation yard, its rope hanging down like a noose. Each step felt like walking deeper into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. She grasped the rope, its hemp fibers rough against her skin. The first pull sent a bronze voice across the plantation, calling the slaves from their morning tasks. The second pull echoed like thunder. By the third, figures were emerging from the quarters, from the fields, from the various outbuildings where their labor kept the Whitmore fortune grinding forward. Ruth watched them gather in the yard below, men with backs bent by years of cotton picking, women with palms worn smooth by endless washing and mending, children who would never know childhood as anything but preparation for bondage. And among them, moving with unconscious grace, was Lily. Her sister looked up toward the bell tower, shading her eyes against the sun. Even from this distance, Ruth could see Lily's smile, bright and trusting. She waved, a small gesture that might have been invisible to anyone else, but Ruth saw it clearly. That wave was a knife to the heart, because Ruth knew, with the terrible certainty of someone who had learned to read the signs, that this might be the last time she would see her sister's smile. Master Whitmore emerged from the house, Thomas at his side. They walked with the leisurely pace of men attending a social gathering rather than an execution. Behind them came two of the white overseers, carrying between them a length of rope and a wooden crate that would serve as a makeshift gallows. The slaves fell silent as their master approached. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through cotton plants and the distant call of a mockingbird. Ruth descended from the bell tower, her legs moving like those of a sleepwalker. She took her place at the edge of the crowd, close enough to see everything but far enough away that she hoped her tears would go unnoticed. "We are gathered here this morning," Master Whitmore began, his voice carrying easily across the yard, "because there has been talk. Dangerous talk. Talk of running away, of abandoning the good life you have here." His words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ruth's eyes found Lily in the crowd. Her sister's face had gone pale, but her spine remained straight. Even now, faced with her own destruction, Lily refused to bow. "This kind of thinking is like a disease," Master Whitmore continued, beginning to pace back and forth in front of the assembled slaves. "If we don't treat it quickly and decisively, it spreads. It infects the whole body. And then what choice do we have but to cut out the infection?" The wooden crate was positioned beneath the lowest branch of an old oak tree. The rope was thrown over the branch with casual efficiency. Ruth felt bile rise in her throat as she watched the noose take shape, its 13 coils a countdown to horror. "Lily," Master Whitmore called out, his voice sharp as a whip crack. "Step forward." The crowd seemed to exhale as one, a sound like wind through dead leaves. Lily moved forward with her head high, her steps measured and deliberate. She might have been walking to church rather than to her death. Ruth wanted to scream, wanted to throw herself between her sister and the noose, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. When Lily reached the makeshift gallows, she turned to face the crowd. Her eyes found Ruth's across the yard, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. In that look, Ruth saw forgiveness, not just for what was about to happen, but for what would come after. Lily understood somehow what this moment would birth in her sister's heart. "Any last words?" Master Whitmore asked, though his tone suggested he hoped there would be none. Lily's voice, when it came, was clear and strong as a church bell. "I regret nothing," she said, "and neither should any of you. Freedom isn't something they can kill. It lives in here." She touched her chest. "And here." She touched her temple. "And they can't touch that." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through the crowd. Ruth saw several slaves straighten their shoulders, saw others lift their chins. Even in death, Lily was dangerous to the Whitmore's power. Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with excitement. He grabbed the noose and slipped it over Lily's head with the casual brutality of a man adjusting a horse's bridle. Lily's eyes never left Ruth's face. Even as the rope tightened around her neck, she smiled, an expression of such serene courage that it took Ruth's breath away. "Any of you who think like this one," Master Whitmore announced, gesturing toward Lily, "this is what awaits you. There is no freedom but what I give you. There is no life but what I allow. Remember that." He nodded to Thomas, who kicked the crate out from under Lily's feet. Ruth's world shattered like glass. The sound her sister made, a desperate, choking gasp, would echo in Ruth's dreams for the rest of her life. Lily's body twisted at the end of the rope, her feet searching for purchase that would never come. The crowd was forced to watch as the light slowly faded from her eyes, as her struggles grew weaker, as the woman who had brought music to their hard lives was transformed into a horrible dancing marionette. Ruth stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as her sister died. She memorized every second, every detail, burning them into her consciousness like brands on flesh. The way the morning sun caught the tears on Lily's cheeks, the sound of the rope creaking against the tree branch, the satisfied smile on Thomas Whitmore's face as he watched the life drain from a human being he had killed for sport. When it was over, when Lily's body hung still and quiet in the Arkansas. Morning, Master Whitmore clapped his hands once sharply. "Back to work," he commanded. "All of you. And remember what you've seen here." The slaves dispersed like smoke, heads down, shoulders bowed. But Ruth remained standing beneath the oak tree, staring up at her sister's body. The rope had left deep marks on Lily's neck, and her face was peaceful now, as if death had been a relief rather than a punishment. "Cut her down this evening," Master Whitmore told one of the overseers. "Bury her in the back field with the others." No marker. Ruth heard the words as if from a great distance. Her body was still there beneath the tree, but her spirit had traveled somewhere else, to a place where rage lived and fed and grew strong. She would remember this morning for the rest of her life. She would remember the taste of helplessness, bitter as copper pennies on her tongue. She would remember the sound of her sister's final breath, cut short by rope and hatred. But most of all, she would remember the faces of the men who had done this thing. She would memorize every line, every pore, every expression of satisfaction as they watched an innocent woman die. And someday soon, she would make them remember it too. The kitchen, when Ruth finally returned to it, felt different. The same brass pots hung from their hooks, the same steel skillets sat ready for use, the same fire burned in the hearth. But now these familiar objects seemed to pulse with new possibility. The knives were no longer just utensils for preparing food. They were instruments of justice. The heavy cookware was no longer just tools. They were weapons waiting to be wielded. Ruth moved through the afternoon in a dream, preparing the evening meal with mechanical precision. Her grip knew the work so well that consciousness was unnecessary. This freed her mind to wander, to plan, to nurture the seed of vengeance that had been planted in the moment she watched her sister die. The Whitmore family gathered for dinner as they always did, their voices filling the dining room with casual chatter about cotton prices and social calls. Ruth served them with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown, but now she studied them with new eyes. She noted how Master Whitmore cut his meat, with confident, aggressive strokes that spoke to his sense of dominion over all things. She observed how Thomas laughed, too loud and too long, the sound of a man trying to convince himself he felt no guilt. She watched Mrs. Whitmore pick at her food with bird-like delicacy, complaining about the heat, the slaves, the endless inconveniences of plantation life. They were so secure in their power, so confident in their safety, that they never noticed the slave woman who stood in the shadows, planning their destruction. That night, Ruth lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters and stared at the ceiling. Sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lily's face in those final moments. Not afraid, not broken, but somehow transcendent. Her sister had faced death with more dignity than her killers would ever possess in life. As autumn's chill crept through the plantation like a slow-moving tide, Ruth's resolve crystallized into something harder than diamond. The cotton fields turned from green to brown to the pale gold of harvest time, and with each passing day, her plan took clearer shape. She began to notice things she had never seen before. The way Master Whitmore locked his study door at night, the location of every window and exit, the patterns of the household's sleep. She also began to listen, in the quarters, in the fields, In the brief moments when slaves could speak freely, she heard whispers of other plantations, other masters, other sisters and brothers who had been made examples of. The Whitmores were not unique in their cruelty. They were simply the particular demons that fate had assigned to her. But demons, Ruth was learning, could be killed. The opportunity came on a night in late autumn, when the first frost had silvered the cotton fields and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Master Whitmore had been drinking heavily at dinner, celebrating a particularly profitable sale of his cotton crop. Thomas had joined him, father and son toasting their success while Ruth cleared their plates and pretended not to exist. By the time Ruth finished cleaning the kitchen, the house was quiet. She could hear Master Whitmore's snores echoing from the master bedroom, could smell the lingering tobacco smoke from Thomas's pipe. Mrs. Whitmore had retired early with one of her headaches, and the other slaves were long since asleep in their quarters. Ruth stood in the darkened kitchen and felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a cloak. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, but she rebuilt it carefully, feeding it with kindling until the flames danced high and bright. The light reflected off the brass vessels and cast strange shadows on the walls. Shadows that looked, to Ruth's eyes, like the spirits of the dead rising to witness justice. She moved with perfect quiet through the house, her feet finding every board that wouldn't creak. In the pantry she found the lamp oil, gallon after gallon of it, stored for the long winter nights ahead. She carried the containers through the house, pouring their contents with surgical precision. The dining room, where the Whitmores had laughed over their evening meal. The parlor, where they entertained guests with stories of their benevolent treatment of their slaves. The hallways where portraits of dead Whitmores gazed down with painted eyes full of inherited cruelty. The smell of oil filled the air like incense in a church of retribution. Ruth worked methodically, her mind clear and focused as it had never been before. This was not madness, this was mathematics. This was the balance sheet of suffering being reconciled at last. When the oil was distributed, Ruth returned to the kitchen one final time. She stood before the fire, watching the flames dance and leap as if they too understood what was about to happen. In her palm she held a piece of kindling, a simple stick of wood that would carry fire like Prometheus bringing flame to humanity. Before she touched the wood to the fire, Ruth spoke aloud to her sister's spirit. "This is for you, Lily. This is for all of us." The kindling caught fire with a hungry whisper. Ruth carried it through the house like a torch, touching it to oil-soaked floors and curtains and furniture. Behind her, flames spread with eager appetite, consuming everything they touched. The house that had been built on human suffering began to burn, and with it, the sins of generations of Whitmores. Ruth stood in the front yard and watched the fire take hold. Through the windows she could see the orange glow spreading from room to room. She heard the first shouts of alarm, saw shadows moving frantically behind glass that would soon shatter from the heat. The Whitmore family was waking to find their world transformed into hell. Master Whitmore appeared at an upstairs window, his nightshirt white as a shroud in the firelight. He was shouting something. Ruth couldn't make out the words over the roar of the flames, but she could see his face clearly. For the first time in her life she saw fear in his eyes. For the first time he understood what it felt like to be helpless. Thomas appeared at another window, then disappeared again. Ruth knew he was trying to find a way out, trying to save himself and his family from the consequences of their cruelty. But the fire had spread too quickly, had consumed too much. There would be no escape from this justice. The heat was growing intense now, forcing Ruth to step back. The flames reached the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky like dying stars. The sound was tremendous. A roaring, crackling symphony of destruction that could probably be heard for miles. In the distance, Ruth could see lights appearing in the slave quarters. The others were waking, drawn by the glow and the sound. Soon they would emerge to watch their master's house burn, and Ruth wondered what they would see in the flames. Would they see justice? Would they see the end of an era? Or would they simply see one slave woman's final act of defiance? The roof collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending a pillar of sparks high into the night. The flames leaped even higher, as if reaching for heaven itself. Ruth stood transfixed by the beauty of it, the way the fire danced and swirled, the way it transformed everything it touched into light and heat and ash. She thought of Lily, and for the first time since the morning beneath the oak tree, Ruth smiled. The fire burned until dawn, reducing the Whitmore plantation house to a skeleton of charred timbers and smoking rubble. By the time the sun rose, painting the Arkansas sky in shades of pink and gold, nothing remained of the building where Ruth had spent so many years in bondage. The authorities would come, of course. There would be questions, investigations, consequences. But Ruth had known that from the beginning. Some acts of justice require the one who performs them to pay the ultimate price. Some freedoms can only be purchased with blood. As the first light of dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Ruth walked to the oak tree where her sister had died. The rope was gone now, cut down and buried with Lily, but the branch remained. Ruth placed her palm on the rough bark and felt, for just a moment, a sense of peace. She had kept her promise. The men who had murdered her sister were dead. The house built on human suffering was destroyed. The system that had crushed so many spirits lay in ashes. It was enough. Ruth turned away from the tree and began walking toward the road that led away from the plantation. Behind her, smoke continued to rise from the ruins, carrying with it the last remnants of the Whitmore legacy. Ahead lay uncertainty, capture, trial, probably death, but also the satisfaction of a promise kept and a debt paid in full. The morning air was cold against her skin, but Ruth felt warm. She carried within her now something that no master could ever take away, the knowledge that she had struck back, that she had transformed her grief into action, her helplessness into power. As she walked, Ruth began to hum one of the spirituals Lily used to sing, about crossing over Jordan, about reaching the promised land. Her voice was rough from smoke and tears, but it carried clearly in the still morning air. Somewhere, she knew, her sister was listening. The sun climbed higher, painting the world in gold and shadow. Ruth walked on, her feet finding their rhythm on the dusty road. She did not look back at the smoking ruins of her former prison. She had no need to. That chapter of her story was finished. This was a new day, a day of reckoning and consequence and, perhaps, a strange kind of freedom. Ruth had learned that sometimes the only way to break chains is to be willing to die trying. Sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to join them. But first, she had walked away from that plantation as a free woman, not because any law had declared it so, but because she had declared it so herself, with fire and courage and the kind of love that burns hotter than any flame. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this story to keep history alive.